it's always interesting to me that people will give up time in the summer to be educated about esoteric topics like the federal farm bill. But I'm pretty excited to welcome Duane Hovorka. Duane and I are a member of a group of retired or semi-retired, although retired but still working environmentalists in the state of Iowa. And so it's been a real pleasure to get to know him closer. When I first met Duane, he was working for the Isaac Walton League, and now he has taken a position with the National Wildlife Federation and is really focused on the federal farm bill. I think everyone on this call has a minimal background. I mentioned earlier to my UMRR board meeting that if you had told me 2 years ago that we would offer an educational program on the federal farm bill and have over 80 people register for it, I would have said, no, I don't think that's going to happen. But it's a testament that you are all here today to the interest that this bill is generating. This is not my first farm bill. I worked on the last two. So it's always a difficult topic. There's politics are the big game players that go on here. And so sometimes our frustration gets high because of previous commitments and previous trades that people have made over the years on the farm bill. Let me just remind everyone that it really isn't a new bill. Because of the politics, it's called a reauthorization of the bill that I think was written first in 34. Duane, do you remember what year it was?
Yeah, back in the 1930s.
Yeah. So we just keep reauthorizing this bill and tweaking it. So, but it's significant, and all of you are a testament. All of you league members are a testament to how wide now the attention is to this particular reauthorization. It only happens every 5 years, but it's a significant bill in terms of what we eat, how we grow our food, how we care for the land. So Duane is in National Airport. His flight got canceled, and so he's not in a real rush to catch a plane. So we have him for the coming hour or longer if we need it. So Wayne, thank you so much for coming and sharing all of your knowledge and all of your experience. Duane's going to share a slide deck, and his focus really is going to be explaining this process. Now, the reauthorization that is currently in place expires at the end of September. What you're going to learn is that may not matter to a lot of people. And so in order to understand how we can impact changing some of and improving the farm bill, Duane's got great information for us. So Duane, again, thanks for joining us. Go to it.
You bet. Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for taking some time to learn a little bit about agriculture policy. I'm going to start with, so I'm Duane Hovorka, currently working for National Wildlife Federation, and I'm one of those people who lobby members of Congress and their staff. So that's what I do during the day, and we also talk to folks at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, primarily about agriculture policy and the conservation part of that. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on, is the impacts of the Farm Bill on the water you drink, on the wildlife that you care about, on the air that you breathe, on the climate that you live in. And so the next slide will just give you a bit of history.
Duane, just a quick interruption.
Yes.
We have a Q&A at the bottom of your screen for all attendees. So if you've got a question at the end of the program, put your question in there for us. Thank you. Go ahead, Duane.
Thanks. That's really helpful. So as Mary Ellen said, the Farm Bill goes back almost 90 years now, and it was first passed as a collection of 3 different bills. One was to try to provide some economic stability for farmers at a time when we had 25% unemployment during the Great Depression. People couldn't afford to buy food. So we had to find a way to keep farmers from going broke. The second piece of it was to deal with soil conservation. And that was the time of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, when all over the Great Plains, there was a huge drought, and some of that, the soil was blowing east, as sometimes it got as far east as the East Coast and Washington, D.C. And then the third part of the Farm Bill was passed in 1939, and that's when they created the food stamp program, which was designed to help feed the poor. So those three pieces of it came together soon into one piece of legislation, which has gone on till today, and it still has those three primary priorities: economic stability for farmers, soil conservation and conservation of other natural resources, and feeding Americans. And that's what we have today. The next slide will give you a sense of how the dollars in the Farm Bill divide out. The big area, more than 3/4 of it, goes to help feed the poor. So that's currently food stamps is called the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, but there's other nutrition programs. The red and the blue pieces of the pie there, which is roughly 16% of the Farm Bill, goes for the safety net for farmers. And that's part of that is subsidized crop insurance that farmers purchase on their crops. Some of it is the commodity programs that you've heard about for the major corn, wheat, soybeans, cotton, peanuts. There's also a dairy program, a sugar program. So that's the safety net for farmers. The green slice, which is about 7% of the pie, is the conservation part of the Farm Bill. That's about $6 billion a year. It's not a very big piece of the Farm Bill, which is somewhere around $85 to $90 billion a year when the last one was passed. And all the rest, all the trade, horticulture, research, there's some energy programs. At the time the 2018 Farm Bill was passed, are about 1% of the Farm Bill. So that Farm Bill is a collection of policies and programs. Congress comes back to it about every 5 years. So it's reauthorized every 5 years since, if you do the math, the last one was 2018. So that one expires this year, September 30th. Most of the programs that are on that pie chart, most of those pieces do not expire automatically September 30th. There's a number of the smaller programs that do, but most of those programs continue. So even if Congress doesn't get to it by September 30th, it seems really unlikely they're going to get done by then. A lot of those programs won't automatically die on the vine there. So the next slide is, it basically is, why should you care about the Farm Bill? And if you're in the upper Mississippi, here's why. Because big parts of Iowa and Illinois, about half of Minnesota, a good portion of Wisconsin are all in farm or ranch land. And what happens on those farms and ranches has a huge impact on the water quality, on the water you drink, on the air that you breathe, on the climate that we live in, on the food that you eat. The Farm Bill drives a lot of those day-to-day decisions, what goes on those farms. And it's especially the commodity program and the crop insurance program. Those safety nets really drive a lot of decisions. The conservation program kind of tries to make up for some of the things that go on farms. And so between the three of them, they really drive day-to-day decisions. So the next slide, the point there is we don't farm like we used to. That a lot of the soil conservation measures, especially that were put in place since the 1930s, have done a good job of trying to reduce soil erosion. So that's the good news, is we don't farm like we used to. On the next slide, you'll see, well, some of the bad news is we don't farm like we used to. So we didn't used to use a whole lot of herbicides and fungicides and rodenticides and other pesticides. We didn't used to use a whole lot of chemical fertilizers back before, the 1940s and 50s. We didn't used to put 10,000 animals in a barn and call that meat production. We didn't used to put 10,000 cattle in a feedlot altogether. So the bad news is we're much more industrial today than we were at one time. And that has some real implications because of the heavy chemical use, because of the heavy concentration of animals. That also has an impact on the water that we drink, on the food that we eat. And so that's I guess part of the bad news is we don't farm like we used to. So on the next slide, you can see just some examples of what some of those conservation programs buy us. What they're doing is helping farmers adopt different kinds of farming systems. And that may be tilling the soil less to reduce erosion, protect soil health. It may be restoring forested areas, planting native grasslands, putting in buffer strips along streams, putting in some better rotational grazing systems for animals. So there's a whole big list of things that these programs are helping. And what they're doing is helping educate farmers about better conservation systems and practices. And they're helping farmers with a share of the cost of adopting those. So that's what those conservation programs do. I'm going to touch on sort of the flavors of programs that we have. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but if you're interested, there's a whole lot online. But just to hit you with the next slide, which is there's 5 major programs that make up that conservation, the green slice of the pie. 3 of them are what we call working lands programs. They're primarily designed to educate farmers and to help them adopt different kinds of practices on their cropland and on their grazing land and with their livestock operations. And they work different ways, but generally you've got about almost $2.5 billion a year that goes for these 3 programs that are on your screen there. And what they're doing is basically helping farmers understand conservation practices and paying for a share of the cost of the equipment, of the seed you might need to plant cover crops, of the equipment you might need, of the infrastructure like fences and waters that you might need to move your cattle around or your sheep around in a better grazing system. So the thing about these programs is the demand from farmers far exceeds the supply. So the programs are currently turning away like 2/3 or more of the farmers who come to the USDA asking for help. Less than 1/3 of them actually get money from these programs. And so that's a real challenge because it's tens of millions of acres of conservation that could be going onto the land that's not going onto the land because our programs are underfunded and we can't support them. So on the next slide, there's a couple more programs that are a little bit different flavor. The Conservation Reserve Program was originally designed to take marginal and highly erodible cropland out of production, to plant grasses, and to put better conservation on the land, to reduce the erosion. It's since grown, and it's more of a working lands program now. About 1/3 of the acres are in what's called a grassland conservation reserve program. About 1/3 of the acres are in things, partial field things like buffer strips along streams, windbreaks, or filter strips at the edge of fields. And so the other 1/3 are in kind of whole fields where we're still, taking land out of production and planting it to grass. And then the Ag Conservation Easement Program is the long-term version of that. So the Conservation Reserve Program does that with 10 or 15-year contracts. So it's kind of medium term. The Ag Conservation Easement Program puts a permanent conservation easement on a piece of land. Typically, there would be either a wetland that we want to restore and protect, or maybe a native prairie that we want to protect. And so that's what the Ag Conservation Easement Program does, is provide that permanent protection. And there again, you've got about $2.5 billion that goes into those programs. And then there's one more important piece on the next slide, which is in the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is the conservation part of the Department of Agriculture. There's something called Conservation Technical Assistance that pays for all those field office people at the U.S. Department of Agriculture who go do tours with farmers, sit at their kitchen table and help them write conservation plans, help them understand these programs and how they might access them. So that's kind of the education and providing technical assistance to farmers who are trying to do these things. And sometimes they need, if you're going to put a terrace in, you need some engineering done to know where to put it. You need graders out there moving dirt around. You need a planter to come in and plant grass seeds over the top of it to get that established. So that's an idea of what that conservation technical assistance provides. It's actually not funded through the Farm Bill. Those other 5 programs get direct funding through the Farm Bill. that's automatic funding every year. And so the Department of Agriculture doesn't have to keep going back to Congress every year to get the money through their annual appropriations. But this conservation technical assistance does come through the annual appropriations process. And so it's about $800 million a year. And because of the tight budgets in Congress, it looks like it's not going to grow over the next couple years. Okay, on the next slide, in part recognizing the shortfall of funding for those programs and the tremendous opportunity of those conservation practices to help address our climate problems. Because most of those conservation practices reduce energy use. So they use diesel fuel or fossil fuel use. If they reduce fertilizer use, that's coming from natural gas. If they're reducing tillage, again, you're saving fuel. If you're improving your soil, that means you're putting more carbon in the soil, more organic matter in the soil. All of those are good for our climate. They help fight climate change. And so last summer, when Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which put hundreds of billions of dollars into clean energy and cleaner transportation, a piece of it, 19.5 billion, also went into these agriculture conservation programs. So what that money is doing is helping with that backlog of all those farmers who were trying to get into, those other working lands programs and getting turned away. This is providing additional money over the next several years in order for those farmers to put in place many of those practices. And the good news is a lot of those same conservation practices are good for water quality. They're good for soil health. They reduce soil erosion. They're good for climate change. They produce healthier food. They produce more wildlife. So they're multi-benefit kinds of practices that are being put in place. So that's the good news. There was also some money there for some renewable energy and some forestry. And so that's really one of the big issues, one of the big fights in this current farm bill is how do we maintain that funding? I talked about that $6 billion baseline funding that goes for those 5 conservation programs, because that is not a big part of the farm bill, but it's by far the hugest pot of money in the land that we have to help farmers and ranchers put in place good conservation. So one of the other things that we've got, so I'll go to the next slide, one more piece of the farm bill, and we call it conservation compliance, but it's basically an agreement by farmers who agree in order to get all those benefits, to get conservation program benefits, to get farm loans and commodity program payments and subsidized crop insurance. They'd agree to do a couple things. They agree not to drain or fill the swamps, the wetlands that are on their lands. And they agree if they have highly erodible soil in their farm, that they'll have a soil conservation plan for it to help reduce soil erosion. There's also a sod saver provision, which is really important in that it reduces the crop insurance subsidy for farmers who break out native prairie. So if you go in and you plow up or you spray and kill native prairie and plant crops, right now we're subsidizing you with federal tax dollars to do that because we're paying the crop insurance that'll help you if the crops don't go so well on that land. What the sod saver provision does is reduce that subsidy so that we don't have quite so much incentive for farmers. The problem is it only applies to 6 states in the upper Midwest, and that includes Minnesota, Iowa, the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Montana. It doesn't include Wisconsin or Illinois. And what we'd like to see is a nationwide sod saver provision. So native prairie, wherever it is, had a little more protection, a little less subsidy to people for tearing it up. So that's, we call that swamp buster and sod saver. So on the next slide, to recap, there's really 2 areas where we have farm bill issues that are in play. And I mentioned conservation funding is the big one. It's $6 billion a year for those annual conservation, for those conservation programs. It's that 19.5 billion that was appropriated last year that's good over the next several years to put in place climate smart practices. we've heard pushback from some in Congress who would like to see us remove those restrictions that require that money to that 19.5 billion to be used for climate smart practices. So what does that mean? And what are the implications? Well, the real implication is that there are a small set of conservation practices that are not climate friendly. And it's things like building a new hog lagoon for your hog barn. That's one that USDA spends some of the money in those conservation programs doing. Doesn't really provide climate benefits, but and so there are other practices like irrigation. If you're putting in place an irrigation system on your farm, it really doesn't do much for the climate. It does help your farm if you need an irrigation system. And so farmers, it's in big demand. But removing those climate smart restrictions means that some of that money could go for some of those things like building hog lagoons and irrigation systems. Right now, at least the Inflation Reduction Act money is supposed to go for climate smart practices. And so it's a shorter list of some of those other practices. And the other issue is that everyone else at the table wants more money. The commodity program folks want more commodity program money. The dairy folks want a better dairy program. The sugar folks want a better sugar program. People talking about crop insurance are talking about higher subsidies for farmers, about expanding crop insurance. The nutrition folks who are very supportive of those programs that feed the poor, are trying to maintain the level of benefits that was established during the pandemic. Congress raised the benefits for the duration of the pandemic. Those just recently, this spring, dropped back to where they were before the pandemic, and people would like to keep those benefits up. Of course, the research community would like more money for research. And the congressional leaders have said, there's no new money. We don't have any new money. We've got enough debt. We've got enough deficit. So congressional leaders are telling the committees, the agriculture committees that are writing the Farm Bill, that there's just no new money for this. So where do you get money? And that's the fight. The only real new money that's there are that 19.5 billion that came last year through the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the other money that came through the Inflation Reduction Act for the Department of Agriculture, for forestry, and for energy programs. So that's one of the big issues, is the funding. And just to recap, there's that wheel again. What we're talking about is, everybody in that pie wants more money for their piece of the pie. If we're not growing the pie, then it's got to come from some other piece of the pie. So that's one of the big fights, is over how much funding and who gets it. And then in the next, there's that next piece of the pie there, kind of show you. And then the next slide is really just to touch on some of the major issues that are in play as they write a new Farm Bill. And where they're at in this new Farm Bill is that they've had a bunch of hearings over the last year and a half. The Senate Agriculture Committee and House Agriculture Committee have reached out to their members, asked them what their priorities are. August went on recess at the end of July. So they're back home all of August. We'll talk about that a little later. But that's where they are. But their staff, for the most part, are still back in Washington, and they're writing those new provisions for the new Farm Bill. So all of that is being written as we speak. Some of it's, a lot of it's already their draft versions that the committee is working on. But some of the key issues that are there, one is really around program structure. And the questions are asking with the Conservation Reserve Program that I mentioned, is that a program that needs a major overhaul? Do we need to do a whole lot of changes to it? Or is it a program that we just kind of need to tweak and make some small adjustments? And in our view, National Wildlife Federation's view, there's some important adjustments we need to make. We don't need a major overhaul. We don't need to, we don't need to remove some of the provisions that make it so beneficial to multiple kinds of practices. So if we're helping soil, air, woods, waters, and wildlife all together with that program, we don't want to change it so that we lose a lot of those benefits. And there have been folks who've suggested it should become a climate reserve program and really just focus all of the money on climate related impacts, climate related practices. And I guess our response to that is almost everything you do with the Conservation Reserve Program provides climate benefits. And so trying to tweak the program so that it maximizes what you can do for the climate means you're going to lose a lot of those other multiple benefits. And we're not sure that, we don't think that's probably the best path forward. With respect to soil health, which farmers and policymakers are increasingly understanding is really important, because the healthier soil you have, the healthier the food you're going to produce, the more nutrients people are going to get, the healthier they're going to be. It, helps us even reduce our medical costs, but it also helps us in terms of conservation. So how do we get widespread adoption and deployment of the soil health practices that we need? And those are things like reducing tillage. So instead of plowing and disking and cultivating every farm, every field several times a year, we want to really reduce it down to nothing, to no-till. If we can get there, that's kind of the gold standard. Planting cover crops when your major crop, when your cash crop is done, so that you put green plants on the land year round, and they're helping feed the soil, feeding the bacteria and the fungus that helps keep soil healthy. So better cover crops is one of those soil health practices. And things on the grazing side, things like moving your animals around. So putting in place some kind of fencing and water so the animals are on that field, on that grass for a day, maybe 2 days, and then they're off to the next pasture, the next piece of the pasture. And if you're moving the cattle around like that, you give the grass time to recover. It's better for the animals, it's better for the farmer, better for wildlife, better for water quality, better for the climate. So all of those. But it takes infrastructure. And so the second part of the soil health dilemma is how and should crop insurance recognize the benefits of soil health. Right now, that's a major piece of the safety net for farmers. It's a big driver for day-to-day decisions. We think the farmers who are putting in place soil health practices the science is showing they're much less likely in a real dry year to have a major crop loss because they've got soil that soaks up water like a sponge and holds it. In a real wet year, they're much less likely to get flooded out because they've got soil that will soak in that water and hold it rather than have it set up on top. So the crop insurance system right now does not recognize that. So those good farmers don't get a good farmer discount, like a good driver discount for crop insurance. We think they should. So that's one of the issues in this next farm bill. And then beyond that, it's, how do we boost the conservation benefits of all of these programs and all these practices? How do we get more climate benefits? How do we slow or stop the loss of grasslands and native prairie around the country? How do we protect wetlands? That's certainly taken on new urgency because the US Supreme Court has declared that most of the wetlands in the country are no longer protected by federal law. Fortunately, because of that swamp buster provision that's in the Farm Bill, most of the wetlands on farms have some protection because the farmers who want to stay part of the program can't drain them or fill them to turn them into crops. But they could drain them and turn them into a golf course, or they could drain them and turn them into a housing development. So there's still a lot of protecting wetlands that we need to do. How do we do that better with the programs we have? And one of the things that we're bringing to the table in terms of the Farm Bill is wildlife corridors. Wildlife move around, especially out west. You have migratory birds, you have antelope and deer and elk and other migratory animals. How do we use the programs to do a little bit better job of promoting those kinds of corridors to help increase the connectivity for wildlife. And then finally, how do we deliver the benefits of the Farm Bill to a diverse farm community? Historically, the Department of Agriculture has a pretty bad track record about meeting the needs of minority farmers, of women farmers, of some of the farmers who are doing specialty crops, who are doing even growing food. The folks who are growing our food don't, who are growing beets and cabbages and lettuce and tomatoes and all the rest of those crops don't really get as well treated as the big commodity farmers who are growing field corn and soybeans and wheat. So how do we do a better job at the Department of Agriculture of meeting the needs, not only of those more diverse farmers, but certainly of the farmers who historically have been discriminated against in a lot of these programs? So those are like the second set of issues that are all in play. Some of those are not so much, spending more money as spending the money we have better and with better thought. So there's a lot of opportunity there. So who's making all these decisions about these, who's answering all these questions? So that next slide will tell you who's on the House and Senate Agriculture Committee in those 4 upper Mississippi states. I know a lot of you are from those 4 states. If you're not from those 4 states, it's okay. You probably have people on the agriculture committees, but there are 5 US senators, Senator Klobuchar and Smith from Minnesota, Senators Grassley and Ernst from Iowa, and Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois, who are on the Senate Agriculture Committee. And if you're looking at the coloring there, the blue members those are Democrats, the red members are Republicans. So you can see it's a mix throughout the region. But those are 5 key people who are helping make those decisions on the Senate Agriculture Committee. There's 11 folks on the House Agriculture Committee from those 4 states. And you can see there are a couple from Minnesota, a couple from Iowa, one from Wisconsin, about 5 or 6, I guess, 6 from Illinois. So there's a lot of opportunity if you live in one of those states for you to have an impact on the folks who are making those kinds of decisions. And we can give you some hints later, but when are they making these decisions? So the next slide is just a timeline there. What's happening in August is all of those House and Senate members are home. They're on recess. There's no sessions of Congress. They're all in their states, in their districts. It's a perfect time to go find them and to try to talk to them, whether it's their town hall or an event they're having or an event you're having or inviting them to a meeting. So that's all happening in August. It's a great opportunity. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C., the committee staff are hard at work drafting the next Farm Bill. We expect the House and Senate bills to have a fair amount of overlap in a lot of the decisions, but we also have some really significant differences. In September, Congress members go back to DC, and I think it's the September 5th for the Senate, September 12th for the House. So you've got them until then, but they all go back, and then they take what they're learning right now back in their districts back, and they start talking to committee staff and committee leaders about what's in these drafts of theirs and which parts they like, which parts they hate, which parts need to change for them to vote for the bill to get it out of committee. And those are incredibly important conversations. So we want those people to go back to DC with clearly in their head understanding how important those conservation programs are, how important these provisions are for our soil, air, water, wildlife. On September 30th, officially, the Farm Bill expires. Some of the programs expire. The Conservation Reserve Program is one that does. That doesn't mean it stops. That just means USDA cannot enroll any more people in it until Congress either extends the program or comes in with a new Farm Bill. So we're expecting from October through December, roughly, that the committees, if they didn't act in September, and September is going to be kind of full, but if they didn't act in September, then probably October, there's going to be serious committee action in the House and the Senate. They're going to take those bills that, assuming they get them out of committee, they're going to take them to the full Senate, the full House. We are very likely to get fairly bipartisan bill approved by the Senate. I think it's more of a dice roll in the House because they've got some more obstacles there to overcome. But they're expecting to have floor time where they can pass a bill in the House. And then there'll be traditionally a conference committee where the leaders of the committees get together and they try to iron out the differences between the House and the Senate bill, come to a final conclusion, goes back to the House and Senate for final approval, and then to the president. So that may happen. People are thinking that may happen by the end of the year. That's kind of the current target that I'm hearing. It may not happen. And what happens in January is things start to get sticky because in January, the commodity programs expire. And so there's some of those programs which are not permanent. And so when farmers are trying to decide what and how to plant and making those decisions, they kind of need to know what their crop insurance is going to look like, what the commodity program is going to look like. There's also other programs that USDA, there's organic programs. There's a lot of research programs. There's a lot of other kinds of community development programs that Congress cannot, or that USDA can't continue to implement because they won't have the money to do it. And so things get really difficult in January, and then you're at the head of an election year. The deeper you get, the harder politically it is to get a new farm bill. So that's your timeline. So we're just about done with this part of it. So there's still time to act. And right now, the next 5 or 6 weeks are really critically important time. If you want to have an impact on what this next one looks like, now's your time. Try to get a meeting with your members of Congress. You don't have to fly to DC. They're back in their state. Attend their town halls. Usually their office will tell you when they're having them. If they're not publicizing them, sometimes they're a little hard to find. Or if they've got events where they're going to be at, very often they go to state fairs, county fairs, things like that. If you're having a meeting, even if it's just a member meeting, invite them to come to your meetings. Sometimes they'll come. And sometimes they won't, sometimes they'll send staff. But if you're having a meeting, an event, maybe a farm tour, for sure invite them and at least get on their radar screen. And then write and call your members of Congress. It's a great time. My advice is send your letter to their district office or their in-state office. Call that local number. Don't send your mail to DC. It takes a long time to get through the mill here. So don't make your call to DC in August. The members are back in their home state. Call them at their local office. You can find their website, congress.gov. You can go find your members of Congress and see what their local offices are, or just drop by. Sometimes they'll be there. Sometimes they'll talk to you. But you can at least leave a note, leave a message with the staff people there. If you want to do more than just talking to them directly, as important as that is, you can write letters to your editor for newspapers or online magazines. You might even write an opinion piece, 500 or 600 words on why this is important. If you want to do that, for sure, we'd be glad to help you. I'm sure the folks at the League of Women Voters would be glad to help you. If you know some reporters, talk to them, tell them how important that farm bill is for the things you care about. And then talk to your friends, your relatives, your colleagues, your Facebook friends. If anybody has MySpace anymore, try that. If you're a Twitter person, I guess you're now an X person. But network with your friends and let them know that this is something that you're thinking about that's important to you. The more we spread the word about the need for good conservation in the next farm bill, the more that buzz gets created, the more that gets back to those members of Congress. So the last slide here is just when you're doing this. So what do you say? So these are some suggested messages. I think, talk to your league friends. I know they may have some specific messages for you, but here's some messages that I think are pretty consistent with the League of Women Voters messaging, which is, 1, protect conservation funding in the new farm bill. And if you call their office, you don't have to spend a lot of time. You don't have to be an expert. They actually appreciate getting a shorter message rather than getting a half-hour long message. The staff do, because they can write it down and it's a clear message and it'll go to the member that way. So here's some options, some things to think about. Protect conservation in the new farm bill. That's a good message. Protect the $20 billion for climate smart agriculture that Congress appropriated last year. That's another good message. Those, again, those funding messages. If you have something, if you're a healthy soil person, let them know you think healthy soil is important and there needs to be more of it in the next farm bill. If you're a fan of wetlands, mention to them that the 2023 farm bill needs to better protect those wetlands in rural areas. If you're a prairie fan, let them know that the farm bill needs to do better to slow the rapid loss of grasslands and native prairie. And that, if you care about climate change, I hope you all do, the 2023 Farm Bill should promote climate smart farming. And those are some pretty top line messages. Again, you don't have to get into a lot of detail if you're writing or you're calling your member. You can put in a little bit of your own, put your own experience in there, why it's important to you, why native prairies are important to you, or why wetlands are important to you, or how you grew up on a farm, or how you visited your grandparents' farm a lot. Make it personal to you, something that speaks to you, and that'll help you speak to those members of Congress. So that's what I got today. Hopefully it gives you, pretty quick overview of what's in the Farm Bill and why it's important, of what those key decisions are, a little bit of timeline there. It's happening now. August is your month, the next 5 or 6 weeks. And hopefully some ideas about how you can interact with those members and some things to say. If you want to reach out to me, you're more than welcome. My cell phone is, I'll even give you that, 402-804-0033. My emails is hovorkad@nwf.org. I think we can probably send those around afterwards if you don't already have them, but I'll stop there and see what kind of questions you have.
Thank you, Duane. Real informative, lots of good basic information. I want to address a couple of questions around the politics. Most people know that I've been actively politically engaged for over 60 years. So a lot of this trading off in the Farm Bill has to do with political relationships, and it's not just party. Sometimes it's sections of the country. The SNAP program, the food stamps got in many years ago with a trade because we didn't have enough actual farmers to support a farm bill. But when you said you're going to feed poor people, then suddenly you had more congressional support. So I'm prone to being skeptical about how much change we can actually impact. So a lot of the league members are asking, if I'm not a farmer, how can I be effective? Okay, and I think you've answered that. Make the call, make the connection. You eat food, right? So that brings me to one. I didn't hear you say anything in your presentation about support for local healthy food. Farmers growing food that we actually eat. Iowa imports over 90% of the food we eat. How do we address that in this Farm Bill? What section is going to help support small farmers who are growing food that I buy on 3 to 5 acres?
That's a great question and a great point. And there are things that we can do in the Farm Bill. And you're right. It's ironic. It's crazy that states like Iowa import so much of their food because the farmers are mostly busy growing corn and soybeans. But there are programs at USDA, and there are some rural development programs. There are also some programs that help support things like farmers markets. So that's one place. And if that's important to you, if rural food, and I think it should be important to everybody, those local foods, that can be part of your message to your member of Congress, that you need those programs that support local food networks and regional food networks, that they are better supported in this Farm Bill, that we're doing more to support the small farmers who are the the fruit and vegetable farmers and do more support for that. So there's a couple areas. There's also one more that if you're a meat eater and you want to eat local pork or local beef or grass-fed beef, it's hard to get those sometimes at the grocery store. But there are some grant programs at USDA which help the local meat processors. So those are those little local meat plants that support local butchers that sometimes they do, deer harvest as well. But a lot of times they'll do that, the local farmer who's doing grass-based, grass-fed cattle, and you want a piece of that, you want to buy from that farmer, or maybe an organic farmer who's got some hogs. They've got to take those to a small plant to get processed so you can buy it. And there are grant programs at the Department of Agriculture that provide support for those folks to expand or to build those so that.
But they're not in the Farm Bill.
They are in the Farm Bill.
They are in
Yes.
So what section of the Farm Bill will I find local food?
So it's probably, so there are the rural development part of the Farm Bill has some of those programs.
Okay.
The organic part of the Farm Bill has some that will support organic farmers who are growing that. So helping them get certified or helping them, learn better pest control methods and things like that.
They're hidden within these small, big lumps.
Right.
So there's been a lot of concern. Well, first of all, I wanted to point out, this is the first time Farm Bill for 1/3 of the House of Representatives, if I'm told that correctly. 1/3 of the House of Representatives was not present, weren't elected for the last Farm Bill. I see that as an opportunity. Even if they're not on an ag committee, I say, go after those newbies. Get to them before somebody else gets to them about your concerns. That's one political action. There have been a lot of questions around the IRA money. Okay? So the Inflation Reduction Act money, there was a lot of it targeted toward agriculture. And some of us are hearing that, particularly in the House, there's a movement to change that. How much of a threat do you see that? In other words, I'm hearing it from some of my legislators. Well, you got all that IRA money. We don't need to increase in the Farm Bill. How do you react to that when I hear that from my senator or representative?
Yeah, and so I do think there is a risk. I think on the Senate side, it appears there's pretty strong support for keeping that money in conservation. But there are at least some, mostly on the Republican side, who are saying, it's fine to keep it in conservation, but we need to take those climate earmarks off of it, take the climate language away and just let that be used for conservation. So that's kind of the Senate discussion. On the House side, some of the things we've heard coming out of some of the folks on the committee are that they're looking for like $80 billion for a list of things that, in the commodity programs and crop insurance and research for other things. And they're trying to find it. And we think it's likely that people will be proposing trade-offs where they say, well, we'll let you keep some of that Inflation Reduction Act climate money, but you'll get some of it as long as we get to use the rest of it for something else. So there's a lot of sort of under the, below the surface discussions that are going on. There haven't been an awful lot of specific public proposals, but I think there is a real risk that some or all that money is going to at least try to be diverted for other uses. And we're going to have to find ways to try to combat that.
I think that's a real issue. I remember the first year I went to DC to meet with Senator Grassley, this was decades ago, about some issue, education. I was supporting then. And, Chuck looked at me and he said, Marianne, I love everything you're talking about. You just tell me where I take the money from. So I did like that you mentioned that when we look at the pie, there's another way to fund things, and that's to enlarge the pie. It's not move
Right.
$1 from another. So when you're talking to people, don't get caught up in that somehow our Congress people have to take money from someone. No, you can enlarge the pie. You can find that money and create it to do that. I do think that one thing would be helpful. You gave us a list of our senators and representatives, but
Mhm.
really, you also mentioned that the staff is doing a lot of work right now. So what I would find helpful is if I could have for each of my congressmen, and Iowa has 4 of them. We have 2
Mhm.
senators and 2 representatives on the Ag Committee, that we had the name of the staff person assigned to Ag. Is it possible to get that list?
It is. And I think we could get that for you.
That would be
So
helpful.
yeah, I can pull those names for the folks that were on
4
that slide.
states, absolutely. Because
Yeah.
you made the point, call them, ask for that person who's responsible for ag policy. Don't take up a lot of their time. Go with a really quick, short statement of what you're supporting. A lot of the league members are urbanites, Duane. They're concerned about, one of the questions is, what impact will I have? I'm not a farmer and I don't own farmland. Why would I call my congressman about the farm bill?
Sure. One of the biggest impacts is you probably drink water every day. So I'm guessing you do. And in the United States, a lot of that water comes out of our streams and rivers and lakes. All of those streams and rivers have farms upstream from them. So almost there's a few exceptions, but certainly in our part of the country, in the middle of the country, there are farms and ranches upstream from almost every municipal water system. And so what's coming off those farms in terms of fertilizer, pesticides, manure is going into that water that then gets treated downstream and you're drinking it. And it's treated to a very high standard, so it makes it drinkable for you. But the problem there is that the more junk in the river, the more it costs to clean it. So whether it's bacteria from manure or it's fertilizer, it's nitrates from fertilizer, or sediment, whatever's going off that farm into the river has to be cleaned up before you can drink it. And so that's, just having cleaner water is, I think, one of the biggest reasons to pick up the phone. And then I think just having, you want to have a healthy community. You want to have, if you care about wildlife, certainly what goes on those farms and ranches impacts wildlife. If you care about the climate, agriculture is a big piece of the climate. And so that's something that we've got to get our handle on. So there's, I guess, a lot of different reasons, but if you live in the city, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't care about the farm bill, because what happens on those farms impacts your water, impacts your air, impacts your climate, impacts the food that you eat.
So a lot of the money that we currently spend on conservation programs, I'm a county soil and water conservation district commissioner. It's an elected position, but we sign off on who gets this money. We sign off on the scoring on those applications. We're hands-on, right? One of the disappointing things that I've seen is how short-term some of these requirements are. So in this farm bill, is there an opportunity for us to really say, if you're going to put it in CRP, maybe it should be 30 years minimum. If you're going to plant a riparian buffer strip, which is now 10 years, right? But get this, we just had this experience. You can pay a penalty and rip that out. So I sit in a seat where we paid a landowner to put in that riparian strip along a stream. The land changed hands. The buyer, because of $8 corn, saw the economic possibility, paid the penalty, ripped out the trees, and planted corn right up to the stream. So is there an opportunity, do you hear any discussion about this, that some of these conservation programs really should be longer term requirement? Because what I'm seeing is some of them are being shortened.
Yes, and so we're trying to find ways to lengthen the lengthen how long those conservation programs keep those practices on the ground. And you mentioned the Conservation Reserve Program. Those are 10 or 15-year contracts. There have been proposals to try to have those lands be a higher priority for putting permanent easements on them. There are states who are doing this. Illinois has a program where they use state money. They use Federal Conservation Reserve Program money to take land right along streams that probably shouldn't be farmed, to take it out of production, plant grasses, put a 10 or 15-year CRP contract on it to put it in conservation that long. And then the state comes in with additional money to make that a permanent easement. So then we get a permanent buffer strip out of it with a combination of state and federal money. And that's a great example of leveraging those state and federal dollars to try to make sure that these practices last. And when we're talking about cropland practices, so things like planting cover crops and reducing tillage and diversifying crop rotations, those are all, or rotational grazing, those are all things that actually deliver financial benefits for the farmer. And they sometimes don't quite understand what those benefits are in terms of reducing the fertilizer they need, reducing or eliminating the pesticides that they need. And if we can educate farmers about the financial benefits of those practices, then they'll keep them on. So after your 5-year contract runs out and USDA is no longer paying you to plant cover crops, if those cover crops are actually paying you through all the benefits they provide, you're going to keep doing it. So I think there's some opportunities there with those soil health practices to keep them going long term.
A couple of questions in the Q&A that I want to ask you. How should CAFOs be addressed, the confined animal feeding operation? What about subsidies for manure digesters to help the farmer and the environment, but instead of incentives for CAFOs, which is essentially subsidizing corn to feed those animals? So is there any way that we can really talk to our legislators about ways to make CAFOs more acceptable? I'm not sure that I even have an answer to that.
So I got two answers for you. One is that the Farm Bill doesn't regulate CAFOs.
Right.
So that's the Clean Water Act. That's the Environmental Protection Agency. So if you're thinking about different ways to regulate them, which is a good thing to think about, the Farm Bill is not your vehicle. And you're probably going to have to look to your state and their regulatory requirements or the Environmental Protection Agency and what they're doing in the Clean Water Act. But what the Farm Bill does is provide some funding for, as you said, some of those biodigesters, for some of the hog lagoons, for some of the water systems that I guess help those CAFOs be less environmentally a problem. Those are the kinds of things that the Farm Bill can address. One of the proposals, one of the suggestions we've had that hasn't got very far in Congress is to stop using conservation dollars to pay farmers who are putting in place those big giant CAFOs. So why should taxpayers help somebody who's going to put 10,000 hogs in a barn or 5,000 hogs in a barn? Why should we help them, pay for their hog lagoon and pay for their, system that they're putting in place? And so that's a suggestion we've had, is that the conservation program should no longer fund those kinds of practices. And of course, the livestock groups hate the proposals, so we've had trouble getting them passed. But that's one way that the Farm Bill could better address what it can in terms of CAFOs.
A couple of questions about corporate agriculture. And that's kind of a sticky word because even a family farm can be incorporated. But a lot of concern that much of this money is going into hands of corporate investors, not actually into hands of farmers. Is there any, and I know that my Senator Grassley had talked about putting a cap on how much commodity support one farmer or one farm could get. What kind of movement do you see toward that in this Farm Bill?
So Senator Grassley over the years has certainly been a champion of trying to put limits, caps on how rich a farm could get and still get these kinds of payments and these kinds of subsidies. He's not had much success over the years. And part of that is because they do things differently in the South in terms of like cotton. And so they have bigger farms. I don't understand the economics and the technology, but basically they have bigger, wealthier farms doing more of the farming in the South. So he's kind of run into a buzzsaw there from other regions who don't want to put those kinds of caps in place. And, you know, as farms get bigger and farmers get more income, bigger farms, more acres, more income, then they push back on that. So there certainly are proposals. The Farm Bill is the place to do that, to try to cap those kinds of things in terms of either capping the amount any one farm can get and reducing that, or capping how rich you can be and still get farm program payments. And so those are some of the things that are on the table. They've been really difficult issues in the last few farm bills because big ag is pretty strong.
And I think that's, I alluded to that at the beginning. Some of the trade-offs in the early days of the Farm Bill were to bring the Southern farmers into the bill because they had a different approach. And we've seen that's a hangover from those early days. And that's why the bill has never started over, because there's a sense that we'd never get a new Farm Bill. Because of those early trade-offs that we got a Farm Bill, and part of it was to bring food stamps into the Farm Bill to get it passed. I've got a few minutes left, but one of the questions, I just want to pull it back up here. I received a letter from Senator Grassley in which he stated environmental regulations must meet the common sense test and should not be more cumbersome or costly than necessary to protect the environment and human health. And this person is, how can this kind of approach be addressed? So I'm not sure I have an answer to that, or you do, but is this a way to fudge the words, pass a common sense test on conservation? Or does Grassley have a point here?
So unfortunately, that kind of language is often used to disparage some of the environmental regulations that are in place. And yes, we need regulations that are reasonable, that do a good job, that they're effective, and that farmers can understand and they can put in place and they can deliver. I think all that's true, but I guess in my view, you know, common sense tells us we need to protect our groundwater and our surface water and our climate, and our land and our soil. And that, you know, common sense tells me we need to be doing more of the things that will protect that. Because right now we're losing huge amounts of soil. And I've heard, and you've probably heard, the biggest agriculture export from the state of Iowa is their soil.
Exactly.
It's not corn or soybeans, it's soil if you measure it, you know. And so anyway, so I guess, you know, sometimes you sort of have to turn their words back on them and say, hey, isn't it just common sense in order to protect our water and protect our soil? And, you know, if we're putting in place common sense requirements for farmers to meet, sounds like common sense to me.
There's a request. Gretchen, would you put Duane's contact information in the chat? It
Sure.
was on his slide, but more people want to see it. So Gretchen can do that for us. There was also a question that I will address, and that is there a sign-on bill or a letter that League of Women Voters organizations can do supporting the $20 billion in conservation funding? Not yet. UMRR is working with League US on presenting a position paper and a call to action on the Farm Bill. Expect that within the month. It's coming and it will be specific. Duane won't be familiar with the process of the League, but we do have a process of advocacy that must meet certain tests. And one of them is, of course, that it's within the parameters of issues that is supported by the League of Women Voters US when it relates to federal legislation. If it's local state, it's a different process. But we are a 4-state, maybe soon to be a 5-state as Missouri joins us, interleague organization. So that process, yes, if you are on the UMRR listserv, you will get that call to action, hopefully, within the next 4 to 6 weeks. It may not happen until after the 1st of September, when we get a better idea. And Duane, my last question to you is, and I don't know if you covered it well, but could you just address marker bills? What are they? How influential are they? Should we pay attention to them?
Yeah, so a marker bill is just a bill that is one piece of the farm bill. So it's an idea that you have to change the farm bill. That's what a marker bill is. And so it's legislative language, and maybe it says, we want this conservation reserve program to have a higher annual payment limit. So instead of $50,000, if you're a landowner who wants to put more land into conservation reserve program, it should be $100,000. So you write out that legislative language, and it can be as simple as that. It can have several different things in it. Usually they're fairly streamlined. And then you introduce it as legislation, and it's called a marker bill because that's kind of your marker that you're putting on the table that you hope will get in the next farm bill. And this year, they've been especially interested in bipartisan marker bills. So if you can get a Democrat and a Republican to sign onto your bill so it gets introduced, then that's the kind of thing the committee staff and the committee leaders will look at and say, well, look, there's Republicans and Democrats who support this change. So if nobody really opposes it, there's a good chance that it might end up in the final bill. So that's what a marker bill is just kind of your idea for what you think the next farm bill should do. And yes, we should pay attention to them, especially the ones that have bipartisan support. Think of them as trial balloons in some cases.
That's what I was going to say. They're trial balloons, aren't they?
Yeah, throwing them out there to get a reaction, hopefully a good reaction. And so that's what they are. So
it is a way for us as constituents to make suggestions to our senators and representatives.
It is. And it's a
very specific issue, like somebody has a concern about CAFOs and manure, they could propose that.
Exactly. And if you like that sod saver idea that I talked about, there's something that Senator Thune from South Dakota and Klobuchar from Minnesota have introduced called the American Prairies Conservation Act. It's one of those marker bills. And if you tell your member of Congress, I support that American Prairies Conservation Act, and I'd like to see it in the next farm bill. That's a real easy message. They know exactly, they can find out exactly what you're talking about if they don't already know what it is. So that's one of the important things about marker bills is it gives you an easy way to communicate with your members of Congress about things you support.
Duane, we've overstepped our time, but it's so important. This is such an important topic. I guess we have to be grateful that your flight was canceled, that you could spend a little extra few minutes with us. But we've had over 40 people on this webinar, and we're grateful for your time and sharing it. I think you brought a lot of just practical advice to how we move forward. So thank you, thank you. Duane has shared through his work with Wildlife Federation document that I will be forwarding on with his permission to Gretchen. And so when she sends out the recording of this webinar, you will also get that document, which kind of highlights some of the key places. I call them sort of the pressure points in the Farm Bill, where we can really speak to that clearly and loudly to Congress. Again, I'll close this up with my impression. This is my third Farm Bill. Not that I wasn't paying attention before, but I think each time I've learned more about the process. And this whole webinar is about reassuring league members, you don't have to be a landowner. You don't have to be a farmer. If you eat food and drink water, the Farm Bill is important to you. And so the information Duane has shared gives us a better foothold when you go and talk to your Congress people and to their aides. Find out who that person is. Duane's going to give us that list that we can really impact it. I have never seen so many non-ag organizations engaged in the Farm Bill as I have this go around. So that means that more people are paying attention. And as Duane said, we all eat food and we all drink the water. So it's important to all of us. Thank you all for joining us. Watch for the recording and Duane's article. Duane, safe travels. I know you have a very, very late flight. But again, we so appreciate your presence today. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks so much.